We all know that the world of Jesus was spiritual and steeped in Scripture, but the daily customs were truly foreign. Have you ever stopped to wonder why shouting unclean was mandatory, or why your brother had to marry your deceased wife? We are going to explore these ancient ways, from the most mundane to the deeply sacred. In today's video, Weird Customs of Jesus' Time That Held Deeper Meaning, we'll talk about why washing dusty feet was the most profound greeting of all. So let's not waste any time, and let's begin. To truly understand the customs of the ancient world, we must first understand the ground upon which the people walked. In the first century, the landscape of Judea was not merely a backdrop for daily life, but a physical force that dictated the rhythm of every hour. The sun, hanging high and white in a cloudless sky, baked the earth until it was hard as pottery and dry as old parchment. When you stepped out of the village, you did not step onto paved sidewalks or asphalt roads, but onto paths of beaten dirt and crushed limestone. This soft, powdery earth was constantly churned by the hooves of donkeys, the wheels of carts, and the steady tramp of thousands of sandals. As a traveler, walking from one town to another, you would find that this fine dust did not stay on the ground, but rose in stifling clouds to coat your skin, your hair, and your clothes in a layer of gray grit. The footwear of the time offered little protection against this pervasive element. Most ordinary people wore simple sandals, which were often nothing more than a sole made of stiff leather or wood held to the foot by thin straps. These open shoes allowed the feet to breathe in the sweltering heat, but they also exposed the traveler to every stone, every thorn, and every pile of animal refuse that littered the public way. To walk a mile in that time was to become intimately acquainted with the filth of the world. By the time a journey was complete, a person's feet were not just tired, they were caked with a mixture of sweat and the accumulated debris of the road. This physical reality created a profound psychological boundary between the chaotic, dirty world outside and the sanctuary of the private home. Therefore, the act of entering a house was not as simple as opening a door and walking inside. To track the filth of the street into the living quarters was a serious breach of social etiquette and hygiene. This necessity gave birth to the nearly universal custom of foot washing, a ritual that served as the primary threshold between the public and private spheres. Beside the door of almost every home, or just inside the entrance, stood large stone or earthenware water jars designated for this specific purpose. The water within was cool, usually drawn from a cistern or a nearby well earlier in the day, offering a stark contrast to the burning heat of the road. However, the act of washing was strictly defined by social hierarchy. In a wealthy household, the lowest-ranking servant, often a non-Jewish slave who was considered on the bottom rung of the domestic ladder, was assigned this task. It was viewed as a demeaning job, requiring one to kneel on the floor, handle the dirty parts of another person's body, and rinse away the waste of the street. For a host to wash a guest's feet himself was unheard of, a reversal of order that would have been shocking to witness. In the absence of a servant, a guest would simply be provided with the basin and water to wash their own feet, a quiet moment of self-service before joining the household. The widespread nature of this custom explains why it was such a deliberate insult to invite someone in but offer them no water. It was a passive-aggressive way of saying that the guest was not truly welcome, or that they were not worth the water it took to cleanse them. Conversely, to have one's feet washed was to be fully received, to have the outside stripped away so that one could be comfortable inside. Imagine the sensation of that moment after a long day of walking on the rocky, uneven hills of Galilee. You sit on a low bench near the door, unlacing the leather straps that have dug into your skin for hours. The cool water is poured over your ankles, turning the gray dust into mud that is gently wiped away with a linen towel. The heat of the journey dissipates from your soles, replaced by a refreshing chill that signals the end of labor and the beginning of rest. It is a restoration of dignity, a physical shedding of the journey's burden. With clean feet, you are now fit to step further into the home, moving from the entryway onto the clean, cool stones of the interior. As you leave the glare of the sun behind, your eyes adjust to the dim, soothing light of the indoors. The noise of the street fades, replaced by the quiet murmur of the household. You are ready to ascend the stairs or enter the main room, where the heart of the family's life beats. This transition brings us to the structure of the house itself, and specifically to the most important room of all, which surprisingly was not inside the house, but on top of it. To the modern mind, a roof is simply a covering, a necessary shield against the elements that exists separate from the living space below. We think of it as a place of shingles and steep angles, visited only for repairs or to retrieve a wayward ball. But in the first century, particularly in the sun-drenched hill country of Judea and the villages of Galilee, the roof was arguably the most vital, most utilized, and most beloved room of the entire house. It was not a slanted lid, but a flat, open expanse that captured the sky and the breeze. The process of building this crucial space was laborious and dictated its function. First, heavy beams of timber, often imported cedar, were laid across the sturdy stone arches of the house. These beams were then covered with a crisscross of thinner brushwood and reeds, creating a coarse mat. Over this lattice, workers would apply a thick, heavy layer of clay and mud mixed with straw. This composite surface was the final shield against the rain, and it needed constant maintenance. After any significant downpour, the homeowner would ascend to the roof and use a heavy cylindrical stone roller, a tool that often stayed permanently up there, to pack the earth down hard and smooth. This maintenance was essential to prevent water from seeping through and ruining the ceiling below, or worse, causing a collapse. Access to this elevated space was almost always provided by a staircase built on the outside wall of the building. This architectural detail is crucial because it meant that one could ascend to the rooftop without having to pass through the private, intimate quarters of the family below. This made the roof a unique hybrid space, private enough for the family's daily life, yet accessible enough to be a place of semi-public reception, especially for male visitors or workers who needed to dry their goods. In the breathless heat of the late afternoon, when the stone walls of the house were still radiating the intense warmth absorbed during the day, the family would slowly migrate upward. This was the moment of relief, the great transition of the day. Here, elevated above the close, stuffy air of the alleyways, they would catch the western breeze blowing in from the sea, watching the purple shadows lengthen across the valleys. The rooftop became the outdoor living room, the space for quiet conversation, the area for preparing vegetables or separating grains, and often, in the height of summer, the bedroom where straw mats would be laid out beneath the stars. The utility and importance of this space were so great that the law governed its construction. Ancient texts specifically commanded that a homeowner must build a parapet, a low stone wall or railing, around the edges of the roof. This was not a mere architectural suggestion for convenience, but a profound moral obligation. Because the roof was an active workspace, where flax was dried, where baskets of figs were laid out, and where children were allowed to run freely. An unguarded edge was considered a dangerous trap, inviting tragedy. The law implicitly taught that a failure to secure this space was tantamount to inviting blood guilt. This essential low wall also served a peaceful social function, providing a comfortable place to lean and look out over the dense, uniform cluster of the village below. Because the houses were built so close together, often sharing walls or separated only by the narrowest of cobbled alleys, the rooftops formed a continuous, elevated network. It was truly a secondary highway of the village. One could theoretically travel from one end of a settlement to the other simply by stepping across the low parapets and walking from roof to roof. This close proximity created a unique acoustic environment, especially in the clear air of the morning. A message shouted from a rooftop would carry across the neighborhood almost instantly, acting as the primary method of broadcasting information. When news needed to be shared quickly, whether it was a warning of travelers, a celebration, or a social proclamation, it was not written on a sign, but shouted from the highest point available. The familiar phrase, "shout it from the housetops," was not a dramatic metaphor. It was simply the fastest way to distribute news to the gathered community. Beyond the bustle of daily work and shared conversation, the rooftop offered a crucial element of spiritual solitude. While the street below was loud with the noise of commerce, animals, and arguments, the roof provided a space of vertical separation and stillness. It was the closet of personal prayer, the quiet sanctuary where one could look past the low surrounding walls, past the dusty village, and up toward the vast, silent canopy of the desert sky. Yet, even this stillness is fleeting. As the sun fully disappears and the air turns crisp, a new scent begins to permeate the atmosphere. The warm, woody smell of cooking fires wafting up from the courtyards below. The day's long labor is finished, and the body's simple, insistent need for sustenance draws the family away from the horizon and the fading light. We must follow them now, descending the stone steps, moving from the airy freedom of the roof into the warm, inviting light of the main room, where the evening meal, the ultimate social event of the day, is about to commence. As we step down from the quiet elevation of the rooftop and enter the main living area, our modern sensibilities about dining must be entirely set aside. The furniture and posture of the first century formal meal created a physical experience utterly unlike the upright, contained formality of a chair and table. For a banquet or a dinner involving honored guests, the entire arrangement was centered on reclining. The dining arrangement was known by the Latin term triclinium, literally meaning three couches. These were not modern sofas. They were low, solid structures, often built of wood or stone, arranged in a U shape around a central serving area. The specific orientation was crucial, leaving one side open to allow servants or the host to move freely, bringing in the food and clearing the debris. The height of these couches was low, allowing the diner to easily reach the low table or mat placed in the center of the U shape. The guests did not sit. They reclined on the couches, leaning heavily on cushions and their left forearms. This seemingly relaxed position was, in fact, a statement of status and freedom. Slaves, laborers, and those of low standing ate quickly, often standing or squatting. To recline was to declare oneself a free person, someone with the leisure and right to enjoy a prolonged, deliberate meal. The posture itself dictated the mechanics of eating. One lay on the left side, supporting the body with the left elbow, leaving the right hand entirely free to reach, tear, dip, and eat the meal. This arrangement, however, was governed by a rigid and often profoundly anxiety-inducing social code. The space was mapped with unspoken rules of hierarchy. The three couches themselves were not equal. Starting from the right of the open side and moving clockwise, the couch to the right was the lowest rank, known as the summum or top. The middle couch was the most esteemed, the medium. The final couch, on the left, was the imum or lowest. The positions dictated the perceived honor of the guest. Furthermore, within each of the three couches, there was a strict internal hierarchy of three positions: top, middle, and bottom. The seat of honor was universally acknowledged to be the middle position on the middle couch, as it placed the guest centrally in the host's view. Conversely, the host often took the last place on the lowest couch, a position that allowed him to rise easily to oversee the servants and the progression of the meal, all while being immediately adjacent to the highest-ranking guest. This complex geography of proximity and elevation meant that every person who entered the room and lay down immediately made a public, physical declaration of their social standing. The tension at any grand banquet often revolved entirely around the politics of this seating chart. To enter the room and immediately presume to take one of the highest seats was a profound social gamble. It required absolute confidence in one's own status or a reckless disregard for social convention. If a more distinguished guest arrived later, the host would have no choice but to suffer the public embarrassment of asking the first guest to physically move down, creating a humiliating walk of shame past all the other recliners. Conversely, the wise or humble guest might intentionally take the lowest possible seat. This was a tactical maneuver, allowing for the possibility of being publicly elevated. A moment of profound social grace when the host, scanning his guests, would warmly call out, "Friend, move up higher." The very structure of the triclinium was designed to test social humility and to make status both rigid and mutable. The tight, intimate arrangement, where the head of one guest was literally near the chest of the one reclining behind him, also fostered a posture of deep intimacy and trust, essential for the conversation and shared life that was about to unfold. Once the physical and social shuffling was complete and the guests were settled, the focus shifted from the external rules of placement to the internal, communal nature of the food being presented on the low central table. Once the complicated ritual of seating was complete and the guests were arranged in the U shape of the triclinium, the atmosphere, though still highly structured, became focused entirely on the consumption of the shared meal. It is here, at the lowest, most fundamental level of dining, that we find one of the most profound customs of the ancient world: the shared bowl. In this era, there was an utter lack of what we would consider modern cutlery. There were no forks, no individual spoons, and knives were used only for the necessary preparation of meat or vegetables, never for the consumption of the meal itself. In the absence of these tools, the primary eating utensil was the most fundamental element of the meal: bread. The bread of the ancient Near East was not the airy, leavened, and quickly perishable loaf that sits on our tables today. It was a flat, dense, and pliable round disc, often baked in the simple earthen ovens known as taboon that we will discuss shortly. This bread was the core of all sustenance, but it served multiple functions beyond simple nourishment. It was the absorbent base for all other flavors, the wipe cloth for greasy fingers, and, crucially, the flexible scoop that navigated the shared vessel. The entire process of consuming the meal was itself a repetitive, rhythmic ritual, perfectly suited for lulling the mind. At the beginning of the meal, a host would take one of these freshly baked discs and, with a deliberate motion, tear a piece. The act of tearing, never cutting with a knife, was a significant detail, seen as respectful to the staff of life. This torn piece, held carefully in the right hand, would then be folded into a small, sturdy shovel, ready for its task. The central bowl sat low on the mat or small table in the middle of the U-shaped arrangement. It contained the main dish, whether a rich, thick lentil stew, a flavorful dipping sauce made from oil and herbs, or a large platter of communal vegetables stewed in stock. The physical act of eating was intensely communal. Everyone at the banquet, regardless of their position on the couches, dipped their small bread scoops into the same vessel. There were no individual plates, no partitioned servings, and therefore no physical boundary to protect personal portions. The line between mine and yours was temporarily dissolved into a unified, shared experience. This created an immediate and profound sense of connection and shared fate. To share a meal in this way was a declaration that you trusted the people around you, that you were safe in their presence, and that you were willing to accept the shared risks of the environment, including the transmission of whatever simple maladies might be passing through the group. If you were known to be sick, or if you were ritually unclean, you could not participate in the communal bowl. Therefore, the simple act of eating with someone was a nonverbal affirmation of their wellness and their belonging. It was the highest covenant of peace. This is why the betrayal of a friend who had eaten my bread was considered the ultimate act of treachery, a crime that went deeper than money or politics. To share the deepest physical intimacy of the table, the dipping into the common vessel, only to then violate that trust, was a failure of the most basic human agreement. The physical bond made the emotional severance feel incomprehensible and horrifying. Within this intense and necessary communal pattern, there existed a more specific and specialized custom known as the SOP. This practice was a direct, personal communication from one diner to another. It involved the host, or another person, seeking to convey high regard, selecting a particularly choice morsel from the common dish. This choice might be a tender piece of meat, a favored vegetable, or, most commonly, a small crust of bread, deliberately saturated with the richest sauce at the bottom of the dish. The host would then dip this selection and, with a subtle but definite movement, reach across the tight space between the reclining guests to place the sop directly into the mouth of the recipient. To be singled out and to receive the sop was a public gesture of honor, a silent expression of deep affection, or a declaration of reconciliation. It was one of the most intimate physical acts that could occur at the table, bypassing all formality and going directly from the giver's hand to the receiver's mouth. This custom was loaded with meaning because the food, the bread, and the seasonings were so fundamentally precious. The savory intensity of the dipping sauce, the earthy flavor of the fresh bread, all relied on a pervasive and essential mineral. As the textures and flavors of the communal meal fade, we turn our attention now to this indispensable rock, the one seasoning that defined every meal, a mineral so vital that it was often used as currency, not just for its taste, but for its profound power of preservation. In the arid world of the first century, salt was an entity far beyond a simple condiment or seasoning. It was a foundational element of civilization, a cornerstone of economics, a powerful symbol of permanence, and, most critically, the fundamental means of survival for all but the most immediate consumption. In a climate where the days were relentlessly hot and refrigeration was non-existent, meat, fish, and most other prepared foods would spoil and rot within mere hours. The ability to preserve these critical food sources against the inevitable decay was entirely dependent on the generous application of salt. It was the only way to arrest the corruption, to lock in a fragile freshness, and to ensure that a significant catch or a harvested animal could sustain a family or a community through the weeks and months that followed. Because of this profound, life and death critical role, salt became deeply woven into the moral and cultural understanding of loyalty and lasting commitment. Covenant of salt was considered the most unbreakable promise one could make, signifying an agreement that would not spoil, that would not corrupt, and that would not fade away with the passage of time. Its intrinsic economic value was so high that it was often used as a form of payment, a fact reflected in the etymology of the word salary. As soldiers and workers were frequently compensated with specific rations of this vital mineral. The majority of the salt used throughout the region around Judea was harvested from the massive, highly concentrated body of water known as the Dead Sea. This source, however, came with a crucial, strange, and fascinating flaw. The crystalline deposits gathered from the shores of the Dead Sea were rarely the pure white sodium chloride we know today. They were naturally and heavily contaminated with a variety of other minerals, most notably gypsum, chalk, and a compound known as carnallite. While the raw deposit tasted strongly salty, it was highly susceptible to chemical change under the right environmental conditions. If this raw, impure salt was stored improperly, exposed to moisture, or simply left out in the open air, the actual, highly soluble sodium chloride component would slowly begin to dissolve and leach out of the mixture. What was left behind was a white, crystallized residue that looked exactly like salt, possessing its structure and color, but having lost all of its salinity and therefore all of its preservative power. This residue was chemically useless for its intended purpose. It could not season food, and it certainly could not preserve a fish. It was the physical embodiment of a precious thing, becoming utterly worthless despite its flawless appearance. Yet, this tasteless residue was not simply abandoned. In a society where waste was unthinkable, even this spent material found one final, ignoble purpose. It was collected and scattered onto the flat earthen roofs we visited in an earlier chapter, or sometimes spread on the heavily trafficked paths and temple courtyards. The inert gypsum and chalk residue was hard and firm, and when trodden underfoot by men and beasts, it helped to bind and harden the loose soil, preventing the paths and roofs from turning into sloppy mud during a sudden, rare rain shower. It had literally descended in value, ending up as nothing more than hardened gravel, a sad and final fate for a substance that was meant to be the essence of incorruptibility. The value of salt extended beyond food preservation and paving stones, reaching even into the method of cooking itself. In most ordinary households, the food for the communal bowl was prepared in an outdoor, beehive-shaped earthen oven called a taboon. Fuel was a constant and pressing concern. Wood was extremely scarce and therefore highly expensive in the arid landscape. The common, readily available, and affordable fuel for these domestic ovens was dried animal dung, usually mixed with straw for binding. To make this low-quality fuel burn hotter, longer, and more efficiently, a necessity for a good bake, a thick slab of salt was often placed permanently at the very base of the oven chamber. This salt acted as a critical heat catalyst, intensifying the flame and regulating the temperature through the low-burning fuel. However, over months of intense, repeated heating from the dung fires, the chemical reaction would inevitably change the composition of the salt block itself. It would gradually lose its catalytic potency and could no longer help the fire burn effectively. When it had given its last measure of heat and could no longer sustain the oven, it was deemed utterly useless to the household. It was then pulled from the base of the taboon and cast out into the alleyway, completing its journey from a precious mineral to discarded common stone on the road. This constant, vital struggle for preservation, for heat, for fuel, and for food underscores the relentless effort required to manage resources in this stark, unforgiving land. But even more critical than the preservation of a meal was the necessary preservation of the body itself through fluid. As the dinner concludes, and the consumption of salty food creates a natural and rising need for hydration, our entire focus shifts from the glowing fire of the oven to the cool, dark, and often perilous depths of the earth, where the most precious liquid resource of all is hidden, waiting to be drawn up. The feeling of thirst is the most primal impulse in an arid land. After the consumption of the salty communal meal in the dry heat, that need for fluid becomes an insistent, undeniable draw, pulling the body away from the warmth of the taboon oven and out into the cooler night air. This need for water dictated the entire rhythm of the ancient village, drawing every inhabitant toward a single, indispensable point in the landscape: the village well. The village well, or the spring, was far more than just a source of hydration. It was the uncontested social heart of the community, It was the central nexus where the private lives of the household spilled over into the public life of the village. The roads leading to it were the most heavily trodden, and the time spent there was not quick. It was a necessary block of social leisure built around the arduous task of drawing water. The well or cistern served as the primary gathering place for the women who were traditionally responsible for this daily, back-breaking labor. The men might meet in the gates of the city, but the women met at the well, exchanging news, arranging marriages, and conducting the subtle diplomacy of neighborhood life. In this context, there was a profound distinction made between two types of water, a distinction that carried spiritual and practical weight. There was the water drawn from a cistern and the water drawn from a flowing spring. Cistern water was stagnant, though necessary. Most homes had a cistern, a deep pit dug into the earth and lined with plaster to capture and hold the winter rains. This water was saved water, still water, water that tasted flat and often grew a thin layer of algae. It was essential for survival, but it was dead water. In contrast, living water referred to the water drawn from a flowing spring or a deep, continuously fed well. This water was cold, clear, mineral-rich, and constantly renewed. It was considered purer, holier, and superior in every respect. To have access to a spring meant prosperity and favor. The labor required to draw this water was significant. The depth of the well could be considerable, sometimes requiring a rope over 100 feet long. The women would descend, carrying large, heavy earthenware jars or pitchers, which were designed to hold substantial volumes of liquid, often 50 pounds or more when full. Imagine the physical process: lowering the rope, feeling the cool splash far below, slowly hauling the great weight back up, hand over hand, rope burning against the palm. The jar is lifted, filled to the brim, and then hoisted onto the shoulder or balanced on the head. The posture required to walk back through the village, back straight, neck rigid, hips balancing the great weight, is one of quiet, enduring strength. This daily task was not quick, nor was it easy. It defined the musculature and the gait of every woman who performed it. The heavy, rhythmic movement of the body, carrying the weight of life, was a powerful, silent display. This shared, recurring labor imbued the location with symbolic significance. It is no accident that the well became a recurring backdrop for some of the most dramatic stories of union and beginning. The meeting of a man and a woman at the well was not a coincidence. It was a recognized setting for the commencement of courtship and betrothal. The appearance of a stranger or the arrival of a traveling man seeking a bride often happened at this place. The shared labor, the necessary public display of character and strength, made the well the perfect proving ground for a future partner. A man could assess the strength of the woman's arm, the patience in her manner, and the warmth of her social interactions simply by watching her fulfill this daily duty. The well was where community watched character unfold under the weight of daily necessity. The earthenware jar itself was a common, fragile, and essential part of the domestic economy. Heavy and difficult to manage, it was always carried in pairs or groups. to help steady the load and share the burden of the journey. When a jar broke, it was a significant loss, representing not just the vessel, but the time and effort it took to purchase or make it. Broken pieces of these jugs were rarely discarded entirely, often being used as scoops or simple tools for cleaning. The clay, once broken, found new, humble utility. The preciousness of this liquid resource, the living water, leads us naturally to the region's other vital drink, wine. Wine was not merely a ceremonial beverage. It was a daily staple, safer to drink than most untreated water and an important source of calories. The dynamics of water, its storage, its purity, and its essential nature, now transition us to the storage and transformation of the fruit of the vine. The vessel for this other liquid, the wineskin, required an entirely different set of rules for preservation, governed by the unpredictable forces of fermentation. Having considered the purity and storage of water in heavy, rigid earthenware, our focus now shifts to the other indispensable liquid resource of the ancient world, wine. Wine was interwoven with daily life, from the simple, diluted table drink that accompanied the lentil stew to the complex, celebratory beverage used in ritual and public ceremony. Given the unreliable and often stagnant nature of water sources, fermented grape juice was a critical element of the diet, providing both a necessary caloric boost and, crucially, a safer alternative to local water due to the purification inherent in the fermentation process itself. The critical challenge for the frugal, ancient householder lay not in making the wine, but in its long-term storage and preservation. Large, heavy ceramic jars, or amphorae, were sometimes used for long-term storage, but the most common, portable, and adaptable method was the wineskin. These were not barrels or glass bottles. They were carefully cured and sewn animal hides, usually from goat or sheep, turned inside out, with the neck or leg holes meticulously sealed with pitch to create a watertight container. The leather of the wineskin was an organic, flexible material, and its relationship with the liquid it held was an intimate chemical dialogue that required careful management and foresight. The moment the fresh, sweet grape juice, known as the new wine, was pressed from the harvest and poured into its vessel, the process of fermentation began in earnest. This was a process of dramatic and powerful chemical transformation. Sugars were converted into alcohol, and, crucially for the integrity of the wineskin, the process released substantial volumes of carbon dioxide gas. This gas would build up within the container, slowly and inexorably exerting pressure and stretching the leather material from the inside. When a wineskin was new, its leather was supple, strong, and highly elastic. It could easily accommodate the mounting pressure and expansion caused by the fermenting gases. The skin would slowly balloon out, stretching resiliently to its limit, and then it would cure and become permanently shaped to its new, expanded volume. The new, flexible skin was perfectly capable of handling the powerful, expansive new wine. However, once a wineskin had gone through the full, rigorous cycle of fermentation and was completely cured, its innate elasticity was essentially gone. The leather was now hard, stiff, and brittle, permanently set in its shape. If the frugal household, seeking to save money or materials, attempted to refill this old, brittle skin with a fresh batch of new wine, the fermentation process would begin again. The gases would build, the pressure would mount, but the old, inelastic leather would be utterly unable to stretch even a fraction more. The material would be strained past its breaking point. The result was inevitable and catastrophic. The old wineskin would rupture dramatically, resulting in the complete loss of both the precious, valuable skin and, perhaps more tragically, the entirely new wine. This was a vivid, practical lesson in the fundamental law of change and adaptability. That new, powerful life, or new beginnings, requires a vessel that is itself and capable of adapting to the inevitable pressure of transformation. The careful and frugal ancient household would certainly not simply discard these old cracked skins once their life as a wine vessel was finished. Once the skins were no longer viable for holding expanding liquid, they were often carefully repurposed and recycled. Because they were now rigid, durable, and non-porous, they were ideal for storing solid, dry goods where pressure was no longer a concern. They would be used for grains, flour, dried beans, or even precious, small tools, serving a final, useful function in the ongoing household economy. This practical lesson in resource management reinforced the idea that materials, like customs, must be fit for the task. New life for new, flexible vessels, and old, stable skins for old, stable materials. This focus on the materials of preservation and storage naturally transitions us to the materials and customs surrounding what the people wore. Just as the wineskin was a vessel defined by its rules of usage, so too was the primary outer garment, defined by an elaborate, deeply meaningful custom, involving small, woven additions that symbolized the entirety of the wearer's moral and religious life. We now shift our gaze from the container of the drink to the material of the robe, examining the subtle details that conveyed identity and authority. Having explored the practical necessity of flexible materials, from the clay of the pitcher to the aging leather of the wineskin, we now turn our attention to the materials and customs surrounding the very body itself, the outer garments of the people. This clothing was far more than simple protection from the elements. It was a statement of law, identity, and personal authority. The most common and essential article of clothing worn over the tunic was the tallit, or mantle. This was a large, square piece of heavy cloth, usually wool, that served as a versatile cloak by day, offering shelter from the sun and the cold, and a necessary blanket by night. It was an extremely expensive, precious piece of property, often carrying the value of a small deposit, so vital that ancient law commanded it could not be kept by a creditor overnight. This expensive garment was not simply a functional piece of woven fabric. It was transformed into a visible, walking billboard of the wearer's religious devotion and commitment to the covenant. This was due entirely to the small, yet profoundly significant, custom of the tzitzit, or tassels. Ancient law required that every adult male wear these specific tassels on the four corners of his outer garment. These were not mere decorations added for aesthetic appeal. Each tassel was composed of a series of meticulously spun cords, often featuring a specific thread dyed with blue from a rare and expensive snail, signifying the blue of the sky and the sea. which ultimately pointed to the glory and purity of God's throne. The most fascinating detail of the tzitzit was the complicated and deliberate knotting pattern. The specific arrangement of windings, spaces, and knots was a carefully designed, physical, tactile mnemonic device. By counting the knots, the number of windings between the knots, and assigning numerical values to the letters of the Hebrew word for tzitzit, the entire physical structure summed up to represent the 613 commandments of the Torah. Thus, every time the wearer touched the corners of his garment, every time he wrapped the mantle around himself or laid it down as a blanket at night, he had a tangible, physical reminder of the entire moral and religious structure of his life. The tassel was a constant, tactile sermon, woven deeply into the fabric of his existence, commanding him to remember and honor the laws of his covenant. Just as the tassel spoke of the law and the divine covenant, the hem of the garment spoke powerfully of earthly authority and personal identity. The hem, particularly the decorative border or fringe at the very edge of the mantle, was a highly significant detail. It was often elaborately woven, embroidered, or finished to indicate the wealth, status, and, most importantly, the established identity of the wearer. For a king, a high priest, or a person of immense political standing, the hem was a signature, a visual and identifiable marker of their personal power. To take hold of a person's hem was therefore an intimate and powerful act, often used in ancient legal settings as a symbolic gesture of profound submission, or, conversely, as a desperate, final plea for help or healing. When a person of known authority, such as a revered rabbi, a respected elder, or a spiritual teacher, passed through a crowd, people often sought to touch the very edge, the small, seemingly insignificant hem of his garment. This act was driven by a belief in the transference of power, a desire to connect directly to the source of his authority, his holiness, or his healing virtue. The physical belief was that the moral and spiritual power of the person extended right down to the physical fringes of his clothing. To seize this small, symbolic part of the fabric was to connect with the totality of the man's identity and life force. Because the mantle and its tassels were so intimately connected to the wearer's identity, status, and moral code, the deliberate destruction of that garment was an act of profound public significance. The tearing of the clothes was reserved for moments when the emotional fabric of a person's life was itself torn beyond repair. The clothing, which usually represented a person's stability and dignity, could be violently used to express the absolute antithesis: emotional chaos, devastating grief, or moral outrage. The preservation and high value of the clothing makes the dramatic custom we are about to explore even more impactful, transforming a simple, expensive piece of cloth into a volatile expression of the soul. The dignity, value, and religious significance placed upon the outer garment, the mantle, stood in direct, shocking contrast to the custom of kraya, or the rending of the garments. This was not the accidental snag or tear of everyday wear. It was a raw, visceral, deliberate act of destruction, reserved only for those extreme moments when the emotional landscape of life was irrevocably shattered. The garment, which usually defined one's integrity and status, was physically ripped at the chest to express emotional chaos, devastating grief over a loss, or profound moral outrage, especially in reaction to what was perceived as blasphemy against the divine name. The custom was a necessary physical manifestation of an internal, unbearable rupture. Imagine the heavy, expensive wool or linen of the outer mantle, the fabric that had kept the wearer warm, dry, and dignified for years. Now, in a sudden, sharp, and highly public motion, the cloth is seized just below the neck and torn downward. The sound itself, the tearing, snapping sound of the expensive, necessary material, was a public, audible declaration of pain that no words alone could adequately convey. It was an instant signal to the community, bypassing all polite conversation and announcing in a sound, "My world has been torn apart." The rules governing this specific act of destruction were surprisingly detailed and were intended to take the moment of raw, unstructured chaos and channel it into a structured, communal ritual that the onlookers could understand and support. For mourning, the tear had to be made in the upper front of the garment, over the heart, literally symbolizing the tearing of the heart itself. The tear could not be merely a small rip. Rabbinic tradition detailed that it had to be large enough to be clearly visible, often defined as a handbreadth, about 3 inches or more in length. It had to be a decisive, clean tear, made with the clear intent of mourning and ritual expression, not accidental damage. Crucially, the tear had to be made upon hearing the news or seeing the cause of the grief, and once made, it could not be immediately repaired. The mourner was required to leave the tear unsewn for a specific, mandated period, often 7 days during the initial, intense phase of mourning, or even longer, depending on the severity of the loss. The jagged, open gap in the garment served as a persistent, visible sign of the person's status as a mourner. This physical disfigurement forced the community to respond with compassion and profound respect, creating a protected, defined space for the duration of the grief. The mourner was literally walking around with a visible, structured wound, transforming their individual emotional pain into a publicly recognized temporary status. This custom starkly differentiated itself between the tearing of the garment as an expression of grief for a relative and the tearing in reaction to blasphemy. For mourning a close relative, the mantle was torn once over the heart. However, upon hearing blasphemy, one was required to tear a second garment or make a second distinct tear, symbolizing an outrage so absolute that it required a deeper, more profound act of personal destruction and disassociation from the words spoken. The clothing became a symbolic mirror of the soul, showing the internal fracturing in the most dramatic external way possible. The act of rending the garment was the ultimate ritual of separation, of loss, and of chaos. It was the physical expression of the world falling apart, a necessary outlet for unbearable pain. Having witnessed this deep, structured expression of sorrow and destruction, our journey now pivots dramatically from the most intense rituals of grief and separation to the opposite pole of human emotion. The next chapter will lead us away from the pain of destruction and toward the rituals that express union, healing, and the greatest human joy. The customs surrounding the ancient, vibrant, and week-long celebration of marriage. The profound, public sadness of the torn garment now recedes, yielding to the anticipation and quiet joy surrounding the ancient ritual of making a new family. Our journey pivots dramatically from the expression of ultimate loss to the structure of ultimate union, the customs of marriage. This process began not with a romantic proposal as we know it today, but with a highly formal, legally binding contract known as kiddushin, often translated simply as betrothal. In the first century, this betrothal was a state of being far more serious and permanent than a modern engagement. It was a commitment that essentially granted the couple the full legal status of marriage, with one vital exception: they did not yet live together. The contract was established by the groom or his father on his behalf, publicly presenting a gift of value, a coin or a valuable object, to the woman in the presence of witnesses, or by the couple sharing a cup of wine. This act, simple on the surface, immediately established a legal bond that was only reversible through the exact same legal process as a divorce. The couple was irrevocably tied. If the bond was broken, a legal document of separation was required, just as if they had lived together for decades. This betrothal period was often cemented by the agreement on the mohar, or bride price. This was a custom frequently misunderstood by modern interpreters. It was not a crass financial transaction where the groom purchased the woman from her father. Rather, the mohar was a significant sum of money or goods of equivalent value, which the groom committed to pay to the bride herself. This sum was held by her father or guardian during the betrothal period, but it legally belonged to the woman. Its primary purpose was not to buy her, but to provide an essential financial security net for her future. If the woman were ever widowed, or if the husband chose to divorce her, this sum, the mohar, was her property. It was her capital, her insurance, and her means of survival in a society where independent economic action for women was severely limited. This financial commitment elevated her dignity and protected her future. Once the kiddushin was formally established and the mohar was secured, the groom would leave the bride's house and return to his own father's home. This separation marked the beginning of the long, necessary period of waiting. The primary task during this time was the preparation of the new dwelling. In the traditional architecture of the time, this often meant the groom was tasked with adding a room or a new wing onto his father's existing house, building a home where he and his bride would live near, but separate from, his own family. This construction was symbolic as well as practical, a labor of love that physically expressed the commitment he had made. This period of physical separation often lasted a full year. The time was necessary for the construction of the room, for the gathering of household goods, and for the bride to prepare her trousseau, her own collection of linens, clothing, and small, precious belongings she would bring to the marriage. During this entire year, the couple remained betrothed, husband and wife in the eyes of the law and the community, yet physically apart. The bride waited patiently in her father's house, knowing that the work on her future home was proceeding, knowing that her husband-to-be was building the physical space for their shared life. The duration of this waiting was entirely in the groom's hands. Only the father, supervising the construction, could declare the new room complete and ready for occupancy. This intense period of patient, watchful waiting was permeated by an atmosphere of ready expectancy. The bride had no set date, no fixed hour for the final event. She simply had the promise that when the home was ready, when the father of the house gave the final word, her husband would come for her. She was to remain ready, along with her companions, anticipating the sound that would shatter the silence of the night, the shout that signaled the procession had begun. This commitment to readiness, this passive yet urgent state of watchful waiting, naturally culminates in the grand public moment of the ceremony itself, when the year-long separation is finally dramatically ended in a spectacle of torchlight and joy. The year-long period of watchful waiting, of construction, and of preparation for the betrothed couple draws to a close, and the moment of union is at hand. Yet, even this final climactic ritual was governed by a unique and compelling custom that amplified the sense of mystery and urgency. The groom would come for his bride at an unknown hour of the night. This was not a daytime affair. The most dramatic and joyous procession of the year unfolded under the cover of darkness. The timing of the arrival was never fixed or announced, determined only by the father of the groom, who gave the final word that the newly built room was complete and furnished. This meant that the bridal party, the bride herself, dressed in her finest clothes, and her young female companions, had to be in a state of constant, ready anticipation. There could be no sleeping soundly, no final, deep relaxation. The call might come at the first shadows of twilight, or, most dramatically, in the deep silence of the middle of the night, around the Roman third watch, when the village was most soundly asleep. The first sound to break the stillness would be a sudden, sharp, joyful shout from the groom's chosen companions as they began their march from the groom's house. This shout, the midnight cry, would alert the bride and her party that the procession had begun. This was the signal to rush to the door, to make sure garments were fully arrayed, and most importantly, to ensure the lamps were fully burning. The wedding procession itself was a grand, beautiful spectacle of light and sound moving through the dark, narrow village streets. Leading the way would be the groom, surrounded by his male friends, accompanied by musicians playing flutes and timbrels, and singing the traditional marriage songs. But the most striking element was the light. In a world utterly lacking in electricity, where the ancient night was a profound velvety darkness, the procession was illuminated by dozens of torches and small clay oil lamps carried by the companions of the groom and the companions of the bride. The flames cast flickering, dancing shadows against the rough stone walls of the houses, transforming the familiar alleyways into a moving canyon of light and joy. As the procession moved, it would gather people from the houses, drawn by the sound of the flutes and the singing, pouring out of the doorways to join the moving stream of light. This journey was slow, winding through the village as the groom moved from his father's house to the bride's father's house, where she waited at the door. When the groom finally arrived, the torches would be held high, illuminating the moment of reunion. He would take his bride, and the procession would reverse, now leading the couple toward their new dwelling, the room the groom had spent the last year building. This return journey was the public climax, confirming the union before the entire community. Upon arrival, the celebrations would begin immediately, commencing a week-long feasting known as the Shiva Brako, the Seven Blessings. This was a period of intense, sustained joy, hospitality, and communal affirmation, where the entire village was expected to participate. Every day, the feast would continue, with new guests invited to honor the couple, and the traditional 7 blessings of marriage recited over the wine. The atmosphere was one of total exuberance, an outpouring of life and hope for the new family. The intense reliance on torches and oil lamps during this pivotal night, essential for transforming the dark into a path of celebration, underscores the profound importance of light in the ancient world. Without light, there could be no public procession, no safe journey, and no visible union. The dependence on a small, steady flame draws our attention to the simple, fragile, yet utterly essential instrument that made life after sunset possible. Our next step is to descend from the excitement of the procession and consider the steady, quiet glow of the clay lamp itself. The vivid, moving spectacle of the wedding procession, cutting a path of celebration through the pitch-black village night, relies entirely on one small, humble object, the clay lamp. Our attention now settles on this essential household item, the primary source of light that structured life after sunset. The lamps commonly used in the 1st century were small, handheld, oval-shaped vessels, often made of terracotta clay, typically referred to as Herodian lamps. A typical clay lamp was designed with a shallow reservoir for the fuel and a small, narrow spout where a twisted wick, usually made of flax, would rest. The wick would draw up the fuel by capillary action, and when lit, it would produce a small, smoky, but steady flame. The fuel was invariably olive oil, the most reliable and affordable source of light in the region. The cost of this illumination, however, was not trivial. Olive oil was a precious commodity central to commerce, diet, and hygiene. Though plentiful in the Galilean region, it still represented a tangible expense for the household. The need to keep a lamp burning, especially during a prolonged event like a week-long wedding feast or a long night of vigil, meant that a constant measure of oil had to be kept readily available. To run out of oil was not a mere inconvenience. It meant a sudden, complete descent into the profound, dangerous darkness of the ancient night. The nature of the ancient night itself must be fully appreciated. In the absence of streetlights or any pervasive artificial light source, the darkness was absolute, a solid physical presence. To step outside the radius of the lamp's glow was to become entirely disoriented. The lamp was, therefore, a symbol of safety, guidance, knowledge, and life itself. To extinguish the light was to invite peril. This understanding of light and darkness gives crucial context to a common household item, the modius, or the bushel basket. This was not just any basket. It was a standardized, essential measuring container used to portion out dry goods, like grain or flour, necessary for trading and baking. It was an object of daily, practical utility, standing perhaps a foot or more high, and wide enough to completely cover a small oil lamp. The idea of placing a lit lamp under a bushel was often invoked to illustrate a profound absurdity. The action served two purposes in the literal sense. If one wanted to safely and quickly extinguish the flame without blowing it out, which would result in hot, messy oil splattering, one could place the heavy ceramic basket over it, starving the flame of oxygen. The other, and more common, literal interpretation was hiding it. To place the light of the house, the source of its safety and visibility, under a heavy, opaque measuring basket was to completely negate its purpose. It was an act of foolishness, extinguishing the very thing meant to give life and guidance in the darkness. The clay lamp, therefore, served as the dividing line between the safety of the house and the dangers of the world outside. Its small, flickering light structured the waking hours inside the home. But even as the lamps inside burned low, the need to guard against the profound darkness outside remained absolute. While the rest of the village slept, protected by the fragile glow of their small oil lamps, others were required to stay awake, listening for dangers and marking the relentless, slow passage of the nocturnal hours. The focus now shifts from the light of the clay lamp to the rhythmic, regulated structure of the deep, empty night itself, and the men whose duty it was to watch over the sleeping community. As the clay lamps inside the homes burn low and the village falls into a profound, heavy silence, the duty of remaining awake falls to the designated watchman, whose task it is to structure and guard the long hours of the ancient night. In the first century, the Jewish tradition of dividing the night into 3 segments had been largely superseded by the standardized Roman system, which divided the time between sunset and sunrise into 4 clearly defined watches. This Roman method provided a precise, regulated structure to the otherwise undifferentiated darkness. It introduced a reliable rhythm where none existed before, regulating the passage of time by the call of the guard. The watches were approximately 3 hours long. The first watch began around 6 o'clock. As the evening meal concluded, the second began around 9 o'clock p.m., when the village was truly asleep. The third, famously known as the middle of the night watch, began around midnight, and the fourth watch began around 3 o'clock a.m., lasting until the first light of sunrise at 6 a.m. This precise, militarized division was vital for the movement of troops, for scheduling long-distance travel, and most importantly, for the reliable scheduling of the guards and watchmen patrolling the city walls. The role of the watchman was one of lonely, repetitive, and cold vigilance. Positioned high on the ramparts of the wall or in the gate towers of the city, his duty was not to fight, but to listen intently for any sound that was not the familiar howl of the wind or the slow, settling creaks of the village's stone architecture. He listened for the subtle, unnatural sound of approaching feet on the dusty road, the soft, lowing sound of animals being clandestinely moved by thieves in the darkness, or the distant, muffled sound of a traveler's voice approaching too late. The watchman was the isolated eyes and ears of the sleeping community, responsible for sounding the immediate alarm to any threat, be it fire, attack, or unauthorized, suspicious approach. His work was a constant, draining struggle against the profound darkness and the heavy, insistent lure of sleep. He would wrap his heavy mantle tightly around himself to ward off the chill that intensified after midnight, his senses strained by the vast, black emptiness outside the city walls. He was the only person awake who was actively marking time, calling out the hour to his counterparts in other sections of the wall, ensuring the unbroken chain of alertness. This system of constant, repeated time calls provided a rhythmic, auditory structure to the blackness, allowing the community, even in their sleep, to subconsciously measure the passing of the night by the periodic, echoing shouts of the guards. This rhythmic call and response was the sound of safety. The focus on the physical protection of the wall and the watchman leads us directly to the most critical physical and social structure of the entire city, the city gate. During the night, the gate was an immense, fortified barrier, a silent, heavy fortress, locked and heavily barred with thick timbers and iron, symbolizing complete separation and impenetrable security. The silence of the gate at night was a weighted silence, the deep slumber of a cautious community. But when the fourth watch ended, and the first streaks of rose-gray light touched the horizon, the gate's function immediately and dramatically transformed. With a great groaning sound, the massive, thick wooden doors, reinforced with iron straps, would be hauled open on their immense hinges. This opening was the official start of the city's day, and it was a burst of sound and movement. The space behind the gate, now fully illuminated, would instantly become the busiest place in the entire region. The city gate was not merely a passage point for travelers. It was the civic courthouse, the primary marketplace, and the public square for all serious matters. The elders, the respected leaders, and judges of the community would assemble inside the spacious recesses of the gate walls, often taking their seats as the doors swung open, sitting there on low, smooth stone benches, surrounded by the immediate flow of people and commerce. They would hold court, judging legal disputes with immediate and public authority. They settled property claims, adjudicated inheritances, mediated disputes over debt, and, crucially, ratified all major business transactions. The gate was the location where a contract became legally binding, where marriage agreements were formalized, and where land transfers were witnessed and authenticated by the city's most trusted officials. To be judged in the gate was to be judged with the highest authority, the fullest public scrutiny, and the most immediate final consequence. The openness of the gate ensured that justice was visible to all. The commerce that flowed through the gate was as essential as the justice administered there. Farmers brought their produce, artisans displayed their finished goods, and economic assets were constantly appraised and discussed among the merchants and the elders. One of the most common and valuable legal and economic assets discussed and formalized at these bustling gates was livestock, specifically the sheep and the shepherds who tended them. The wealth and stability of many families was measured not in coins, which were volatile, but in the size, health, and quality of their flock. And it is to the vulnerable, slow-moving rhythm of the sheep that our attention must now turn. The bustling sound and legal weight of the city gate, with its discussions of wealth and commerce, leads us directly out of the stone walls and into the rough, vulnerable reality of the open fields, where much of that wealth resided. The most common and essential figure in this landscape was the shepherd, a person whose life was defined by solitude, vigilance, and the constant threat of danger. Shepherding was not an idyllic, peaceful occupation. It was a deeply rugged, difficult existence, requiring immense courage and unending patience, often carried out in isolation under the harsh sun and the dangerous night. The shepherd's constant companions were not people, but his two essential tools, both carved from wood, but serving entirely different functions: the rod and the staff. These were not interchangeable objects. Each held a specific purpose, essential to the survival and management of the flock. The rod was the shorter, thicker piece of wood, often heavy and knobbed, resembling a small club. It was the shepherd's primary weapon of defense, his means of protection against the most immediate threats: the nocturnal attacks of wolves, bears, or lions that roamed the wilder parts of the Judean wilderness. The rod was swung with force, a tool of striking and fighting, intended to break the bones of a predator before it could scatter or kill the vulnerable sheep. Beyond defense, the rod was also used for counting the sheep. As the animals filed through a narrow opening, the shepherd would use the rod to tap them, passing them under the rod to ensure every single one was accounted for before they settled down for the night. It was, thus, a tool of judgment, protection, and rigorous accountability. The staff, in contrast, was the long, slender pole, typically taller than the shepherd himself, often topped with a gentle curve or hook. The staff was a tool of guidance and comfort. It was used to pull a lamb out of a crevice, to gently nudge a sheep back onto the right path, or to probe the ground ahead for hidden pits or snakes. When the sheep were nervous, the staff was held out horizontally, creating a line of safety through which the sheep could pass, feeling the shepherd's presence above them. It was a tool of leadership, correction, and reassurance, never of violence. When night fell, the shepherd would lead his flock into a simple, temporary sheepfold. This was often an enclosure made of stacked, rough stones, built without a roof to contain the animals and deter wild animals. The design was deliberately incomplete, featuring a single, wide opening, a gap in the stone wall that remained unprotected. When all the sheep were safely inside, the shepherd himself would lie down across this single opening. In doing so, the shepherd literally became the door. No animal, whether a timid sheep wanting to wander or a ravenous wolf seeking entrance, could enter or exit the fold without physically encountering the shepherd's body. He sacrificed his comfort and his rest, placing himself as the living barrier between the flock and the dangers of the night. His presence assured the sheep's safety, and his body served as the final, absolute guarantee of their preservation until dawn. This intensely personal and physical connection to the land and to the necessity of provision transitions us from the nomadic rhythm of the shepherd to the settled, seasonal rhythm of the farmer. The shepherd was an outsider, always moving. The farmer was bound to one place. The farmer's life was an act of hope and patience, dependent not on the strength of a rod, but on the capriciousness of the weather and the difficult, unyielding nature of the soil. We now turn to the critical first step in the cycle of agriculture, the casting of the seed onto the unforgiving earth. Having observed the shepherd's rugged vigilance in the wilderness, we turn our attention now to the settled, patient labor of the farmer, whose life was not about moving, but about remaining bound to a single, difficult plot of earth. His existence revolved around the precise, relentless cycles of the agricultural calendar, and the first and most critical act was the casting of the seed, a deceptively simple action that was, in reality, an act of tremendous faith and high risk in the often unyielding geography of the ancient Near East. The farming method employed was the ancient, simple technique known as broadcast sowing, and the specific order of operations was critical to understanding the eventual, various fates of the seed. Unlike modern practice, where the ground is meticulously plowed first and then seed is drilled into the prepared furrows, the ancient farmer often broadcast the seed before the deep plowing was done. Walking with a rhythmic, steady sweeping motion, a gait learned over generations, the sower would scatter handfuls of grain randomly over the field. He carried the seeds in a fold of his heavy mantle or a leather pouch slung across his shoulder, his eyes fixed not on the ground, but on the trajectory of his arm, ensuring an even distribution. Only after the seed lay scattered would the oxen be brought in to pull the simple wooden plow, turning the soil over in a hopeful attempt to cover the scattered seeds and bury them safely beneath the earth. Because the seed was broadcast first, the sower could not perfectly control where every kernel landed, and the field was not a uniform, perfect canvas. As the hand swept across the field, much of the seed would indeed land on the thin, workable soil. But inevitably, some would fall outside the area designated for the crop. Some seeds would fall upon the hard, compacted earth of the well-worn pathways that often ran straight through the middle of the large fields, cutting them into workable segments. These paths, trodden hard and flattened by generations of human feet and the heavy hooves of beasts of burden, offered no soft soil for germination. The seeds lay exposed and vulnerable on the surface, unable to penetrate the hardened crust. They were quickly consumed by the sharp-eyed, opportunistic birds, doves, sparrows, and crows that followed the sower, waiting for their easy, predictable meal. These were seeds that never began their journey. Other, more hopeful seeds would land on the shallow, rocky patches that extensively defined the difficult terrain of Judea and Galilee. This geography was distinctively challenging. Much of the land was supported by a thick, unyielding base of gray limestone bedrock, covered only by a thin, uneven, and often sparse layer of topsoil. Where the wind or erosion had thinned this soil, the seed would germinate with surprising quickness, thanks to the shallow, intense warmth radiated by the sun-baked rock immediately below the surface. The seed would send out roots with immediate speed, mistaking the heat for abundant life. But the instant the delicate rootlets hit the impenetrable, solid limestone, their growth would be stopped cold. Having no depth for moisture retention and no access to deeper nutrients, the tiny plants would quickly sprout into a fragile green, only to encounter the first fierce, desiccating heat wave of the late spring. The afternoon sun would intensify, burning the life out of the thin, root-bound sprouts that had no reserves to draw upon, causing them to wither and perish with visible speed. A third difficult category of seeds would fall into the fertile pockets of soil where previous, less diligent farmers had allowed deeply rooted thorny weeds and tenacious thistles to go to seed. Here, the grain seed would initially sprout successfully, and the roots would find purchase in the rich earth. But as the plants grew upward, the native, hardy, and aggressive thorns and weeds having deeper, established root systems and the advantage of being native to the difficult soil, would quickly grow taller and wider, forming a dense, impenetrable canopy. They would suck up all the available moisture and sunlight, effectively shadowing and choking the life out of the fragile grain plants before they could complete their cycle, mature, and produce a viable, heavy head of grain. Only the seed that fell on the rare, deep, and truly good earth would survive all these challenges. The simple act of the sower, casting the handfuls of grain across the land, was thus a visceral act of trust, a daily reminder that the survival of the family for the next year depended entirely on forces, the depth of the soil, the capriciousness of the rainfall, and the randomness of the broadcast, that were entirely outside the farmer's immediate control. The successful seed, once it had struggled through all these perils, would grow tall and heavy, its head bowing under the weight of the ripe grain, eventually leading to the long, arduous labor of the harvest, the necessary second major act of the agricultural cycle. The anxious waiting of the farmer, which began with the casting of the seed upon the challenging ground, now culminates in the immense, celebratory, and utterly exhausting labor of the harvest. Once the grain had successfully navigated the perils of the thin soil and the scorching sun, it was cut with sickles and gathered into thick, heavy bundles. The next vital step in transforming the stalks of grain into edible, life-sustaining flour was the essential process of separation, which centered around a permanent communal fixture, the threshing floor. The threshing floor was always chosen with careful, practical intent, and its location was non-negotiable. It was a large, flat, circular area, often 50 feet or more in diameter, usually paved with natural, flat stone or meticulously hardened clay and mud, and critically, it was located on the highest, most exposed, and windiest point just outside the village walls. The high location was not for any ceremonial purpose. It was absolutely essential for the next step of the process. The harvest bundles, piled high and dried, were brought to this floor and spread out in a thick, uniform layer across the surface. The work of separating the heavy grain kernels from the light, brittle husks was a communal effort powered by the largest available domestic animals. Pairs of oxen would be tethered together and driven round and round the floor, tirelessly trampling the bundles of wheat or barley, often to increase the efficiency of the crushing, heavy, sled-like wooden implements. Flat wooden planks, studded underneath with sharp stones or iron teeth, would be dragged behind the oxen, adding concentrated weight and friction. The relentless pressure of the animal's hooves and the weighted sleds crushed the dry stalks, shattering the tough husks and forcefully releasing the precious, dense kernels of grain from their protective casings. This threshing process was noisy, dusty, and hot, conducted under the burning heat of the late summer sun. The air was thick with the smell of dry straw, the pungent odor of animal sweat, and the fine dust of shattered husks. The reward for the labor was the immense pile of trampled material, a mixture of heavy grain, finely crushed straw, which was valuable for animal feed and bedding, and the paper-thin, useless husks, or chaff. This mixture represented the raw material of survival, but it was still useless until it was purified. The next, even more skilled and precise step was the purification of this mixture, a ritual of separation performed using a specific tool, the winnowing fork. The winnowing fork was not a common pitchfork. It was a large, specialized implement, essentially a giant wide, flat scoop made of wood, often with prongs or teeth at the front edge. It was heavy, requiring considerable strength and skill to use correctly. The winnower, typically the head of the household or a skilled worker, would wait patiently for the wind to be at its peak, usually late in the afternoon or early evening, when the sun began to drop and the breezes intensified. The worker would stand at the edge of the threshing floor, directly facing the breeze. He would use the fork to scoop up a massive portion of the threshed mixture and, with a powerful, practiced upward motion, toss the entire load high into the air, allowing it to hang suspended for a moment above his head. As the material sailed upward, the intense, steady wind would immediately catch it. The heavy, valuable grain kernels, being dense and substantial, resisted the wind and would fall almost straight down, dropping safely back onto the clean, swept area of the threshing floor. But the paper-light husks, the chaff, possessed almost no mass. They would be caught instantly by the breeze and carried away, scattering harmlessly over the edge of the high floor and down the hill. The fine crushed straw would fall separately in an intermediate zone to be gathered later for animal bedding or fuel. This visible, dramatic separation of the heavy grain from the light chaff was not merely a mechanical process. It was a deeply ingrained cultural and religious symbol for judgment, purification, and the harsh reality of survival. It visually represented the separation of the essential from the worthless. What was heavy, substantial, and of life-sustaining value remained. What was light, useless, and easily carried away was discarded. The successful execution of this critical labor ensured the community had the necessary flour for the year's bread. While the grain provided the staple for life, another essential crop, requiring its own specialized preparation and patience, provided the region's sweetness, celebration, and its other vital drink. We now leave the dusty threshing floor and turn our focus to the terraced hillsides where the precious fruit of the vine was cultivated. From the sun-baked level expanse of the communal threshing floor, our focus now rises vertically to the terraced hillsides where the most tender, costly, and celebrated crop, the grape, was cultivated. The successful creation and operation of a vineyard was the ultimate mark of family prosperity, requiring immense and sustained labor, absolute commitment, and above all, years of profound, deliberate patience. Unlike the grain crop, which promised and yielded its return in a single season, the establishment of a full vineyard was a generational investment that required several years of waiting before the first true productive harvest could be gathered. The creation of a vineyard in the rocky, steep, and sloping terrain was an arduous, continuous task. The hillsides were first shaped by constructing long, curving stone retaining walls to create wide, level steps, known as terraces. These terraces were essential for holding the precious, thin topsoil in place and preventing it from washing away during the rare but violent winter rains. If the walls were not strong, the entire field could be lost in a single storm. Once the terraces were formed, The farmers had to laboriously and backbreakingly clear the fields of the native, deep-rooted stones that perpetually worked their way up through the soil. These stones were then piled up along the edges of the terraces, serving the dual purpose of reinforcing the walls and ridding the ground of obstacles. The vine itself was then planted, but the yield was not immediate. The first 2 or 3 years of the vine's life were dedicated entirely to establishing a deep, strong root system and to careful, rigorous pruning. The vine was intentionally prevented from bearing fruit too soon, sacrificing immediate pleasure for long-term strength. The initial small grapes produced were often bitter and were entirely discarded. It took several years, 4 to 5 typically, before the vine was mature enough to produce the rich, sweet fruit suitable for wine or consumption. This prolonged delay demanded a deep, quiet trust in the future, a commitment that spanned beyond the immediate needs of the farmer and often became the heritage of his children. Within the working vineyard, 2 structures were physically essential. The first was the winepress, the site of the harvest's transformation. This was not a portable device, but a massive, deep basin dug directly into the underlying, natural, unyielding bedrock of the hillside. A typical press consisted of 2 linked vats. The upper vat, known as the treading floor, was large, shallow, and wide, where the clusters of grapes would be poured and ritually trodden by foot, often to the sound of singing. The juice, sticky and red, would then flow by gravity through a channeled spout into the second, lower vat. This lower basin, which was smaller and much deeper, acted as the collection basin where the purified juice settled. This physical process, the joyful, communal, messy crushing of the fruit into the unyielding stone, was one of the most visceral and immediate transformations of the agricultural year, turning perishable fruit into stable wealth. The second equally necessary structure was the stone watchtower, or migdal. Vineyards were particularly vulnerable to both animal and human thieves. Foxes, drawn by the smell of the ripening grapes, were notorious for raiding the dense clusters, and human opportunists often saw the exposed, ripening fruit as an easy target for theft. To guard against these threats, the farmer would construct a sturdy, circular, or square watchtower, built entirely of the stones cleared from the field itself. This tower was constructed high enough to provide a clear, comprehensive view of the entire vineyard and the surrounding roads and paths. During the crucial, vulnerable ripening and harvesting months, a watchman, often the farmer or a responsible member of his family, would sleep and stand guard in this tower, placing a constant, visible human presence between the precious, delicate crop and the dangers of the open land. The entire vineyard, with its neat stone terraces, its deep carved press, and its lonely stone tower, was the embodiment of deliberate, committed patience and watchful ownership. This agricultural patience, measured in years rather than seasons, extends to the most durable, long-lived, and significant tree of the region, the one that provided the oil for the lamps that lit the night watches, the basic element of commerce, and the eternal symbol of peace and prosperity. It is to the silent, slow-growing endurance of the olive tree that our final focus must now turn. The patient endurance required for the vineyard's long-awaited harvest now guides our attention to the most durable, long-lived, and significant tree in the entire region, the olive tree. This tree was the cornerstone of the ancient economy, providing the oil for fuel, the basis for commerce, the main source of fat in the diet, and the ultimate symbol of peace and prosperity. Unlike the fleeting annual grain, the olive tree was an eternal presence, capable of surviving for centuries, with trunks that twisted into gnarled, massive shapes, bearing witness to generations of human life. The labor associated with the olive harvest was heavy, industrial, and central to the entire community's survival. The transformation of the olive fruit into its oil required an immense, crushing weight, applied in a sequence of controlled violence. This process took place in the Gethsemane, a term that literally translates from the Aramaic as oil press. The Gethsemane was typically a substantial, stone-built structure that housed the heavy machinery necessary to extract the precious liquid. The first step was the crushing of the olives. The fruit, gathered after being beaten from the branches, was dumped into a large, concave basin. A heavy stone wheel, often 6 or more feet in diameter and powered by oxen or donkeys, would be rolled over the olives, grinding the skins, pulp, and pits into a thick, oily mash known as the amurca. This heavy aromatic mash was then scooped up and packed tightly into round, flat baskets woven from reeds or rope. These full baskets were then stacked one upon the other, placed directly beneath the great wooden beam of the press. The extraction process itself was divided into 3 distinct, carefully managed stages, each yielding an oil of different quality and purpose. The first stage was the most delicate and required the least pressure. The weight of the stacked baskets alone, or perhaps a slight initial tightening of the press's massive screw, was sufficient to squeeze out the first, purest flow of oil. This oil was exquisitely clear, almost colorless, and entirely free of sediment or particulate matter. It was considered the highest grade, the light itself. This first pressing was reserved exclusively for the most sacred purposes. It was the oil used to fuel the eternal lamps in the temple, the oil designated for anointing priests and kings, and the purest light to signify the divine presence. It was precious beyond measure. Once this initial, gentle flow had been gathered, the second stage of pressing would begin. The heavy wooden beam of the press was lowered further, and intense, sustained pressure was applied, usually by inserting thick wooden wedges or by slowly turning a massive wooden screw, requiring the effort of multiple men. This application of crushing, sustained weight forced out a much larger volume of oil. This second pressing was slightly lower in quality, often possessing a faint greenish hue and a slightly thicker texture. This was the oil of the household, the primary source of fat for cooking, the essential base for various medicines and unguents, and the fuel for the small, daily clay lamps that lit the homes. It was the oil of daily life, commerce, and health. Finally, after the second stream had been exhausted, the full, crushing weight of the press, the absolute maximum pressure the structure could endure, was brought to bear. This final, violent stage squeezed out every last drop of moisture and oil from the compressed pulp. The resulting liquid was dark, thick, and cloudy, often requiring further processing to make it usable. This third pressing oil was designated for the lowest, most utilitarian purposes. It was used to produce soap for washing clothes, as a low-grade lubricant for tools, and sometimes as a cheap fuel source for fires. This sequential process, from the purest light to the heaviest utility, demonstrates how the community meticulously maximized the value of every single fruit. The olive press, therefore, was a structure of profound symbolic weight. It represented the power of sustained pressure, the refinement that comes from enduring immense weight, and the tiered nature of value. The outcome of this heavy, earthen, and highly organized industrial process, however, stands in stark contrast to the fluid, dynamic, and unpredictable work found on the region's famous body of water. We now leave the stone press and move to the shores of the Sea of Galilee, where the economy was one of nets, waves, and constant movement. The heavy, deliberate, and localized industry of the olive press now gives way to the fluid, dynamic, and communal work found on the vast freshwater expanse of the Sea of Galilee. This large, teardrop-shaped body of water, known in the first century as the Sea of Tiberias or the Lake of Gennesaret, was the vital economic heart of the entire northern region. Its waters were rich with fish, making the entire economy of the surrounding villages, Capernaum, Bethsaida, Magdala, dependent on the daily catch brought in by the fishermen. The tools and techniques employed by the fishermen were varied, each suited to different conditions and requiring different degrees of communal effort. The simplest and most iconic tool was the cast net. This net was a large, circular piece of finely woven mesh, weighted around its edges with small pieces of lead or stone. A single fisherman, often standing in shallow water or from the bow of a small boat, would coil the net carefully over his arm and then, with a practiced, powerful motion, cast it outward in a wide, flat arc. The net would spread out like a sudden, circular canopy, sinking quickly and trapping any fish unfortunate enough to be beneath its dome. This was the tool of the solitary, independent fisherman, a highly skilled labor requiring immense precision and timing. However, the greatest wealth and the most substantial catch came not from the solitary cast net, but from the immense dragnet or seine net. The dragnet was a massive industrial instrument, sometimes hundreds of yards long, designed to sweep entire sections of the lake. It was a net that demanded complete cooperation and the effort of an entire crew, usually consisting of several boats and a dozen or more men. The large net would be meticulously laid out in a massive arc far from shore, its weighted bottom sinking toward the lake bed, while its cork-lined top floated on the surface. Once the net was set, the true labor began. The teams of fishermen would return to the shore or shallow water, taking up the heavy ropes attached to the ends of the net. The process of hauling in the net was a sustained, brutal effort of sheer force. The men would strain and pull, their feet sinking into the mud and sand, their muscles burning, as they slowly, inch by agonizing inch, dragged the vast, water-filled, and heavy net toward the land. The weight of the water, the resistance of the drag through the mud, and the struggling mass of the catch made this a labor of maximum physical exertion. When the dragnet finally came ashore, collapsing in a huge wet pile, the work was still not done. The catch was chaotic. a teeming, mixed-up mass of various species, sizes, and aquatic life. At this point, the critical process of sorting began, governed entirely by the strict rules of Jewish dietary law. Not all fish were considered clean or permissible to eat. According to the laws of Moses, only fish that possessed both fins and scales were considered clean. All others, such as eels, catfish, or other smooth-skinned, scaleless creatures, were classified as unclean, or tref. The fishermen would immediately commence the task of separating the permissible from the forbidden. The clean fish, the large-scaled and marketable catch, would be kept and prepared for sale. The unclean, non-kosher fish were discarded, often thrown out onto the shore to be scavenged by birds or buried, as they held no economic or dietary value to the Jewish community. This ritual of sorting was an inherent part of the daily labor, a constant, tangible reminder of the division between the sacred and the profane, the clean and the unclean, dictated by the covenant. The profitable portion of the catch represented immediate income and wealth, a liquid form of currency that would sustain the fisherman and his family. The complexities of this income, the need to sell it, to use it for purchases, and critically to account for it, brings us directly back to the land, to the cities, and to the immense friction caused by the Roman system of taxation. The fishermen's honest earnings became entangled in the web of imperial demands, leading us directly to the most despised figures in the marketplace, the tax collectors. The immediate, visible income generated by the haul of the Galilee fishermen now forces our attention back to the centers of commerce and the despised, heavy hand of Roman administration. The tax system of the first century was designed not for fairness, but for the maximum extraction of wealth, and it was operated by a ruthless, localized mechanism known as tax farming. Tax farming was a system where the Roman authorities would not collect taxes directly. Instead, the right to collect taxes for an entire district or region was sold off to the highest bidder, often a wealthy local notable or a syndicate of wealthy businessmen. These individuals purchased the right to collect a specific amount mandated by Rome, plus an agreed-upon percentage for local infrastructure. Every shekel collected over that guaranteed amount became the personal, massive profit of the tax farmer. This entire system bred corruption, exploitation, and deep resentment as the collectors were incentivized to squeeze every possible denarius from the populace. The individuals responsible for the day-to-day collection were the tax collectors themselves, or publicani. Unlike the tax farmers who operated from behind the scenes, these collectors were highly visible and universally despised. They were almost always locals, Jews, who had betrayed their community for Roman money and protection. They operated from their tax booths, often set up at city gates, harbor entrances, and major crossroads, demanding customs duties on goods, levies on harvests, and personal poll taxes. Their presence was a constant, tangible reminder of the subjugation of the Jewish people to the foreign, pagan power of Rome. The friction inherent in this system was not only economic, but profoundly religious, centering on the simple copper and silver coins used in daily transactions. The official currency of the empire was the Roman denarius, a small silver coin that bore the image of the reigning Caesar often Tiberius, on one side, and a Latin inscription on the other, declaring the emperor as the son of the divine Augustus and Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest. For the devout Jew, this coin was an abomination. The law strictly forbade the creation or worship of graven images, and carrying the coin was a necessity that constantly violated the spirit of this commandment. Worse still, the inscription declared a mortal man to be divine and the chief priest of a pagan religion. The use of the Roman currency was thus a daily, necessary compromise with idolatry. This religious offense reached its climax at the temple in Jerusalem. Temple taxes and offerings had to be paid in the ancient Jewish shekel, which did not bear any graven image. Roman coins were strictly forbidden within the temple walls. This necessity created the secondary, essential service of the money changers, who operated just outside the temple entrance. They exchanged the ritually impure Roman and Greek coinage for the pure temple currency, charging a fee for the service. The exchange was essential for religious life, but the high fees charged by the money changers fueled further resentment, turning a religious necessity into another source of exploitation. The constant, agonizing friction between the demands of the Roman occupation, represented by the tax collector, and the idolatrous coin, and the deeply held beliefs of the covenant, led to the establishment of incredibly strict, rigorous laws designed to preserve Jewish identity. The leaders of the community, concerned with maintaining separation and holiness, developed a vast body of regulations to govern every aspect of life. This intense desire for purity and identity preservation was most rigidly and elaborately expressed in the sacred observance of time, specifically the complete cessation of activity on the Sabbath. The intense friction caused by the daily encounter with the idolatrous Roman coin now leads us directly to the most revered and complex pillar of Jewish life: the strict, elaborate observance of the Sabbath day. The Sabbath was the ultimate expression of the covenant, a weekly period of complete separation from the profane activity of the world, designed to remember the creation and the deliverance from bondage. It was a 24-hour period, from sunset on Friday until sunset on Saturday, when the very concept of work was entirely redefined and absolutely forbidden. The rabbinic authorities and legal scholars of the time had meticulously defined what constituted forbidden work. Not merely physical exertion, but the 39 specific categories of creative activity that were necessary to build the tabernacle in the wilderness. These activities included lighting a fire, sewing, plowing, baking, slaughtering, tying a knot, and, critically, carrying an item from a private domain to a public domain, or carrying it over a specified distance. This prohibition on carrying and moving objects was one of the most frequently encountered limitations of the Sabbath. One could not simply pick up a household item and carry it into the street. The carrying of objects became synonymous with the prohibited labor of the marketplace. Furthermore, traveling itself was severely restricted. A Jewish person was forbidden to travel more than 2,000 cubits, approximately half a mile, or about 1,000 yards, outside the boundary of their city or dwelling on the Sabbath. This fixed perimeter was known as the Sabbath day's journey. This restriction was not intended to keep people locked inside their homes. It was designed to prevent any commerce or activities that might lead to business or farming, confining the entire community to a sacred, manageable space. However, the human spirit, while seeking to honor the deep, abiding necessity of the law, also sought to maintain the viability of communal life. The law, as written, was absolute, but the need for community, for shared meals, and for visiting the sick or elderly within the local vicinity remained urgent. This tension led to the development of a remarkable legal mechanism known as the eruv, or mixture, which was essentially a legal loophole designed to extend the definition of a private domain. The eruv worked by merging multiple private properties or dwellings into a single collective private domain. This was done by physically linking the properties. Often, this involved erecting a symbolic boundary, sometimes simply a cord or wire stretched across the tops of the poles and walls that framed a courtyard or even an entire neighborhood. By establishing this symbolic boundary, the entire area within the eruv was legally considered one large, shared private dwelling. Suddenly, activities like carrying bread from one house to another, or carrying a pitcher to an elderly neighbor, were legally permissible, because the objects were now moving entirely within one vast shared private domain. A separate eruv could also be established to extend the Sabbath day's journey itself. By placing food or some other item of value at a spot 2,000 cubits outside the city on Friday afternoon, the person could legally claim that spot as his temporary dwelling for the Sabbath. Since the law allowed a person to travel 2,000 cubits from his dwelling, he could effectively extend his traveling radius another 2,000 cubits beyond the boundary of the city, using the pre-placed food as his new legal center point. This elaborate effort to honor the spirit of the law while maintaining the necessities of community life shows the profound desire to make the Sabbath holy and enjoyable, a day of rest and shared life rather than isolated restriction. This intense focus on the spiritual health of the community and the preservation of identity through legal and temporal separation naturally transitions us to the most immediate and personal concern of the ancient world, the physical health of the body itself. If the Sabbath governed time and space, the laws of purification governed physical contact and ritual status, creating a strict hierarchy of clean and unclean that fundamentally dictated human interaction and communal inclusion. The intense focus on legal boundaries and the preservation of sacred time now brings us to the ultimate intersection of physical illness and ritual status, the terrifying stigma of tzarath. There was a severe affliction of the skin and sometimes of clothing or houses, often inaccurately translated simply as leprosy, yet encompassing a wider variety of serious dermatological conditions. The man afflicted with tzarath did not merely suffer from a painful physical disease. He was deemed fundamentally and absolutely ritually unclean, separated from the community by the divine law itself, a symbol of corruption and spiritual death. The social isolation this required was total, immediate, and brutally enforced. A person diagnosed with tzarath by the priest, who served as the sole public health authority, was instantly cast out from the community. He was strictly forbidden from living within the protective walls of the city or village, and was forced to dwell in lonely, segregated settlements outside the confines of human society, often in caves or ruins in the desolate wilderness. His very physical appearance was required to reflect his tragic ritual status. His clothes had to be visibly torn. His hair was to be left unbound and unkempt, and a covering was mandatory over his upper lip and mouth, a symbolic gesture of perpetual mourning and silent shame. His isolation was not passive. He was compelled by law to actively warn others of his contagious presence. Whenever he approached an uninfected person, or if a person accidentally approached him, whether on a narrow path or at a water source, he was required to raise his voice and shout the single, devastating, ritualistic word, "Unclean, unclean." This shout was a cry of self-identification and a necessary warning to prevent accidental ritual defilement that could spread throughout the community. It meant that every stranger he met, every distant relative who might pass by, was forced to recoil and flee, avoiding contact at all costs. He was legally, ritually, and functionally dead to his family, his friends, and his entire communal life, a pariah existing in a physical and spiritual void. The shout was a constant auditory expression of his utter social death, a perpetual reminder of his exiled status. The depth of shame and fear surrounding this disease was absolute, making the afflicted person a living metaphor for total spiritual impurity and social decay. If, however, by some miracle of remission or natural healing, the visible marks of the disease began to fade, the priest was required to conduct a thorough examination. This examination was often done twice, demonstrating the law's caution against premature re-entry. If the healing was confirmed, the community did not simply welcome the person back with open arms. Reintegration required an elaborate, detailed, and utterly specific ritual of cleansing that profoundly emphasized the connection between physical health and ritual purity, marking the passage from the realm of the ritually dead back into the land of the living. The ritual required the use of 4 highly symbolic items, each representing a facet of life and cleansing. The priest would first take 2 live, clean birds, usually sparrows. One bird was ritually killed over a clay pot filled with spring-fed, running, or living water, its blood mixing with the fresh water. The cedar wood, representing endurance, life, and the strength of the forest, the scarlet yarn, symbolizing life, vitality, and health, and the small, brittle branches of hyssop, a common herb used for purification, were all bound together and dipped into the blood and water mixture, along with the living, remaining bird. The now convalescent person was sprinkled 7 times with this mixture, marking his transition through the completion of the ritual number. Crucially, the living bird was then released into the open field and allowed to fly away. This release was the powerful, climactic moment of the entire ceremony, symbolizing the disease being ritually carried away and the purified person being set free to fly back toward his community and his home. Following this initial ceremony, the cleansed person was allowed to re-enter the camp or city, though he had to remain outside his own dwelling for a full week. A further, intense process of shaving all the hair on his body, a second full washing, and a complex series of sacrificial offerings, including a guilt offering, a sin offering, and a burnt offering, followed, ensuring every single trace of the former impurity was was dealt with and atoned for. This elaborate, painstaking process shows that purity was not a passive state or a simple physical absence of disease. It was a ritual accomplishment, a careful, costly, and communal path back to full inclusion. This profound focus on mortality and the dramatic separation it caused naturally brings us to the ultimate moment of separation, the final rites of passage and the customs of burial, the extreme ritual separation imposed by the affliction of Tzarath, which required such an elaborate ritual to reverse, now gives way to the ultimate, irrevocable ritual separation, death. In the first century Jewish world, the rituals surrounding mortality were driven by a single, powerful imperative: protecting the living community from the contagious defilement of the dead. Contact with a corpse, known as tumah or ritual impurity, rendered a person intensely and universally unclean, requiring a full week of separation and specific rites of purification involving the ashes of a red heifer. The necessity of preventing accidental defilement was never more urgent than in the weeks leading up to the great pilgrimage festivals, such as Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, when hundreds of thousands of devout travelers would converge on Jerusalem from all parts of the Roman world. These pilgrims needed to be in a state of absolute ritual purity to participate in the temple services. An entire, vast, systematic precaution was therefore devised by the religious authorities to protect these masses of people from inadvertently touching a tomb, a bone, or the entrance to a burial cave, and thus becoming immediately, severely unclean. This systematic precaution led to the mandatory practice of whitewashing the tombs. Tombs, often cut into rock faces or built as simple stone structures in the fields and hillsides outside the cities, were painted with a heavy, visible coating of lime wash, typically applied a month before the major festivals. The practice was not for decoration, ceremony, or beauty. It was purely for visibility and safety. The stark, brilliant white color against the brown, rocky landscape served as a massive, unambiguous warning sign to pilgrims and ordinary passers-by alike. Danger! Unclean! Stay away! This urgent necessity to mark the boundary between the living and the dead gives historical context to the phrase whited sepulchres, representing something clean and pure and highly visible on the surface, but internally filled with the most potent source of defilement. The whitewash was a necessary lie, a clean mask over the reality of decay. The burial customs themselves were not a single, final act, but a deliberate, organized two-stage process. The first stage occurred immediately after death, which was required to happen before nightfall. Given the warm climate and the necessity of dealing with the ritual defilement quickly, the body was washed, anointed with spices, wrapped tightly in linen shrouds, and immediately taken to the family tomb. The body was placed within the rock-cut tomb on a simple stone bench or ledge, often accompanied by oil lamps and spices. This was intended only as a temporary resting place. The second stage of burial, the final, permanent interment, occurred approximately a year later. During the intervening months, the organic matter of the body would decompose. After a year, once the flesh had fully deteriorated, the family would return to the tomb, a somber, profoundly meaningful, and final task known as bone gathering. The bones would be collected, meticulously cleaned, and placed into a small, carved limestone chest known as an ossuary or bone box. These ossuaries were typically simple, rectangular boxes, sometimes decorated, and often bearing the name of the deceased scrawled in charcoal or scratched into the stone, serving as the person's final, eternal resting place. The ossuary was then moved from the primary burial niche and stored in a shared collection room within the tomb, allowing the bones of multiple generations of a single family to be literally gathered together in one sacred, permanent space. This practice of secondary burial, the collection of the bones, held immense spiritual and emotional significance. The ancient phrase for death was often described as being gathered to his people, and this custom made that phrase physically manifest. It meant that the ancestors of a family were physically united, their lineage preserved and reaffirmed in a tangible, stone-bound form. This profound concern for the preservation of the physical remnants and the deep desire to keep the family line united naturally extends to an even greater concern: the preservation of the family name and its legacy in the ancestral land. The profound societal concern for lineage and the physical gathering of ancestors in the bone boxes now leads us directly to the severe legal mechanisms established to ensure a family line, and its corresponding claim to the ancestral land could never be extinguished, and its assets never be permanently dispersed. The preservation of the family name and its holding of the inherited property was not merely a matter of pride or wealth accumulation. It was an absolute religious and social imperative tied to the concept of eternal covenant and identity. Two specific, powerful concepts govern this preservation: the levirate marriage and the highly structured role of the kinsman redeemer. The custom of levirate marriage, or yibum, was triggered by a specific, tragic event: the death of a married man who left behind no living male heir. If a brother died childless, his surviving brother was legally and morally obligated to marry the deceased man's widow. This was not a typical marriage of affection or choice. Its sole, overriding purpose was theological and communal: to produce an heir for the dead man. The first son born of this required union would not be considered the son of the living father, but would legally and socially be reckoned as the son of the deceased brother. This child was born specifically to inherit the dead man's name and property, ensuring that the lineage did not vanish from Israel and the land remained in the original family's possession. This duty was so sacrosanct that a man who refused to perform it was subjected to a public, humiliating ritual known as halitza, where the widow would remove his sandal and spit in his face, signifying his disgraceful reluctance to walk in the footsteps of duty and compassion. While the levirate marriage focused narrowly on the continuance of the name within a direct, immediate family unit, the broader protection of the family's economic stability and personal freedom was the domain of the goel, the kinsman redeemer. The goel was a specific person, always the nearest living male relative capable of performing the duty, who bore the legal and moral responsibility to act as the clan's champion, advocate, and rescuer in times of distress. The duties of the goel were immense, far-reaching, and required personal sacrifice. If a family member, through overwhelming debt, famine, or misfortune, was forced to sell his ancestral land, the most precious of all assets, the goel had the responsibility to step forward and buy that land back at any cost, ensuring the family's permanent possession was not lost to outsiders before the next Jubilee year. Similarly, and perhaps more profoundly, if a relative became so poor that he was forced to sell himself or his children into temporary slavery to repay a crushing debt, the goel was required to pay the full price of redemption, setting the relative free and restoring him to his family and his identity. Beyond economic and personal redemption, the goel also bore the legal duty to avenge the death of a murdered family member, though this duty had softened in later periods. This office was a duty of financial sacrifice, personal intervention, and profound, enduring loyalty to the tribe and the ancestors. The goel literally served as the restorer of broken fortunes, the guarantor of solvency, and the ultimate protector of the family's integrity and name in the public eye. These customs, the painful but necessary duty of Yibam and the sacrificial responsibility of the goel, were powerful manifestations of a belief system that placed the eternal survival of the lineage above the temporary concerns or comfort of the individual. They ensured that both the name and the property remained intact, passed down through the generations, secured against the ravages of death, debt, and misfortune. This deep concern for the enduring word, for the unbroken chain of history, now brings us to the final, most sacred expression of how these truths, laws, and narratives were kept and preserved: the physical, tangible scrolls of the synagogue. The deep concern for lineage and the enduring legacy of the family name, which drove the strict laws of the kinsman redeemer and the complex customs of burial, now directs us to the ultimate source of that legacy and law: the written word itself, housed within the sanctuary of the synagogue. The synagogue was the central, most defining institution of Jewish communal life in the first century, serving not just as a place for prayer, but as the town center, the primary school, the court for local matters, and the revered repository of the sacred texts. The focal point of the entire building, the axis around which the communal identity revolved, was the ark, a chest or cabinet typically built into the wall facing the sacred direction of Jerusalem, which housed the most precious possessions of the community: the scrolls of the law, the prophets, and the writings. These were not books as we understand them today, bound and shelved, but long, continuous sheets of parchment, treated animal skin, painstakingly handwritten by a professional scribe using prescribed inks and careful methods. These sheets were affixed to wooden rollers at either end. They were immense objects, often heavy and cumbersome due to the length and density of the parchment, requiring strength and reverence to handle, bound with linen bands and often covered with elaborate silk or velvet mantles for protection and honor. The presence of the scrolls transformed the simple assembly hall into a sanctuary. The individual responsible for the physical care of these texts and the smooth, ordered functioning of the entire worship service was the hazan, a role that is best translated as the attendant, sexton, or the physical caretaker of the synagogue. The hazan was not the rabbi, who was the intellectual teacher and interpreter of the law. Instead, the hazan was the custodian of the physical order. He cared for the oil lamps, prepared the reading platform, maintained the order of the assembly, and, most crucially, was responsible for fetching the weighty scrolls from the ark, unrolling them to the correct portion with practiced care, and meticulously rolling them back up when the reading was finished. He was the guardian of the physical word. ensuring its preservation and ritual protection. When the appointed time for the scripture reading arrived, the Hazan would bring the heavy scroll to the designated reader. The reading of the law was done standing, a universal posture of respect and active worship, acknowledging the divine authority of the text that stood above the reader. The act of unrolling the scroll was not merely practical. It was a highly ceremonial moment, the physical manifestation of revealing the ancient, sacred narrative to the listening community. The tension and silence in the room would deepen as the roller was turned and the columns of text were revealed. In profound contrast to the public, standing recitation of the law, the subsequent teaching, interpretation of the scripture were universally done sitting down. When a respected teacher, a visiting sage, or a recognized rabbi finished the public reading, he would often ascend a raised seat or bench, known as the seat of Moses, and sit, a pose that symbolized authority, careful contemplation, and the deliberation required for wisdom. This was the moment when the ancient words of the law were brought into the immediate, tangible context of the community's daily life, the moment of application. The teacher would take the divine word and use it to shed light on the daily struggles with Roman taxation, the application of the laws of the Sabbath, the requirements of tithing, or the complexities of ritual purity, making the ancient text directly relevant to the current generation. The entire service, and indeed the life of the community, revolved around the central, physical presence of the scroll. It was the source of all identity, all law, all memory, and all hope for the future. As our own comprehensive journey through the essential elements of this ancient world concludes, we must imagine the final scene of the service. The standing reading is complete, the sitting teaching has ended, and the Hazan, with utmost care, approaches the reading platform. He gathers the loose parchment, rolls the document tightly and meticulously back onto its wooden rollers, securing it with its thick linen band, and places the revered object back within the ark. The sacred word is safe, preserved for the next time it will be unrolled. With the scroll put away, the light dims, the assembly disperses back to their homes, and our journey through the fundamental, enduring elements of this ancient world, the land, the law, and the life it produced, comes to its respectful and final conclusion.